Well, as we can do now, we're just going to slip across the other side of the Atlantic, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Though, in some respects, for anyone that's been to any of the herd conferences, there's not a lot to really introduce Donagh, other than he's been perhaps one of our most popular speakers over a number of events. One interesting thing about Donagh that Deanne found out, at the moment he must be in the middle of lambing, because he seems to be up all hours of the day, which is where he is today, a little bit up a little later in the day. But Donagh is a senior principal investigator in statistical genetics at Chiswick at Moore Park, as well as director of Vista Milk SFI Research Centre. And as I said, he farms beef, sheep and horses. I'm not sure in which order. Obviously there'll be some profitability index that he have in sorting that out. And he's responsible for the research on genetics in dairy cattle, and responsible for the development and implementation of genomic evaluations in dairy, beef, sheep in Ireland. As director of Vista Milk, he leads a team of over 200 scientists. So incredible to have a day job with that, and development and deployment of digital technologies in precision dairy farming. So Donagh, I really welcome you here today, and thank you very much for your patience. So over to you.
Thanks, Graham. Yeah, you're right. I'm actually coming to the end of my lambing, and I'm starting my calving now as well. But it's a nice opportunity to come into the office for a break and actually wear pants for the first time, giving a Zoom call. When I knew I was talking to people down under, I said I better cover up down under. Look, those of you that have heard me talk before know I like a bit of fun, and although I kind of made a little bit of a joke at the start of the slide from semen to slaughter, it is actually true, because we are seeing a bit of it now, and I think we're going to see more and more of it into the future, is contracting all the way back from the end product, from the retail, back to what semen is actually going to be used. So I'm going to take you on that little journey, but just to start off, so we're all clear, what is a decision support system? Well, if you get it from Wikipedia, this is where I got it from, it's a computerized program which is used, and is important, to support decisions, not to make those decisions, but to support them, the determinations, judgments, and the courses of action. How I would paraphrase that is helping us make more informed decisions faster. Now, decision support tools are going to be more and more used. From a UK study, half of the farmers that were surveyed used a decision support tool, and roughly around a third were software-based, a third were paper-based, and 10% were apps. But of course, as we see the population demographics change, we're going to see a shift on that more towards software and apps-based. How I see decision support tools is a vehicle for the deployment of all the innovation that Deborah has just talked about, but also what everybody else is going to talk about for the course of today. So this is a snapshot. I've purposely made it very complex. I'm not going to leave it on there very long, because I know people like John Martin are going to think up of other things that can go in here, but this is just focusing on a selection of the decisions that have to be made during the breeding season. Right, and we're going to go through those bit by bit. And it's very much a whirlwind tour, but I'm going to give you publications, references there that you can go and look up yourselves. So if we start off with the first one, pre-breeding. For those of you involved in seasonal breeding, you want to decide, well, what cows am I going to breed, or what cows am I going to cull? And if those that you're going to breed, well, am I going to breed them to good dairy semen, or am I going to breed them to poor semen? So if we start off with just what cows you're going to breed, from a breeding tools perspective, we have our national breeding goals. And you can't really see this slide, but there's a selection, or this is just showing you the representation of different breeding goals that exist around the world. They all have their own different traits, and they all have their own different emphasis within the traits. Now, the last time I spoke, I think it was herd 17, I made the point that there's only 2 countries in the world that have actually proven that their indexes translate into more profitability. One was Ireland and one was Australia. That was 4 years ago. And there's only one other country that's actually done it since, which is the US. So it puzzles me really as to how people can have or sell breeding goals or genetic evaluations, yet there's no evidence that they actually work, apart from the likes of Australia. So we're seeing here Joe Newton has done some stuff on the BPI, and John Martin has done some stuff on the genetic evaluations themselves, and found issues, and I think he's going to give a talk about that earlier on. We must always challenge what we do. Incidentally, in Ireland, we're completely revamping our fertility evaluations this year. What we've recognised is we've selected on fertility for the past 20 years, and our genetic evaluations work really, really well. But our base population has improved so much that our fertility evaluations in the really good herds are not really working that well. So we're having to revise all of that. The next important point to consider is what's the future going to hold. If you think about it, like a semen that you're going to, or a bull calf that's going to be purchased in the coming calving season, right, for use in AI. It's going to be 10 months, 12 months before the animal actually produces semen that goes into a cow, 9-month gestation, 2 years before that calf actually becomes a cow. You're breeding for something which is probably 5 to 10 years down the line. So you're breeding for something for 2030. What is the population and the country going to look like in 2030? And this is the real difficult part for geneticists, is predicting the future. So there's 3 things that a trait must fulfill in order to be included in a breeding goal. Firstly, it must be important. And while traditionally a lot of our indexes are economic based, we may have to rethink that. We look at the way that social policy and license to farm is going, we may have to include public good traits in there. And putting an emphasis on that is going to be difficult, especially if you're actually going to reduce the rate of genetic gain in other traits, which will happen, because you're pulling emphasis off the profit-driven traits and putting them onto public good traits. The second point is it must exhibit genetic variability, and that's a given. Every single trait exhibits genetic variability. Even if it's tiny, we can still make massive progress on it. And then thirdly, and this is the most important one, I guess, from our perspective, is the trait must be measurable or correlated with a measurable trait. And Jenny would have, I'm sure, already talked about things like feed intake and what Dairy Bio has been doing in that area. So if I stand back from our breeding index, and this is probably the same for most across the world, I would say there's 3 suites of traits that are missing from our indices, or poorly represented. One is milk quality, and Deborah actually talked about that from a fatty acids perspective, but also things like conjugated linoleic acid, omega-3, etc. That's the first one. Second one is animal well-being. And a lot of our indexes just focus on the animal once it becomes a cow. But I think any people who do any farming recognise the time that's put onto that calf that just won't get up and suck, or is just scoury. That takes a huge amount of time. So I think we have to look at the early calf life. And the fourth one is environment. And while everybody's talking about methane and carbon, I actually don't know what the situation is in Australia, but to me, there's probably a more pressing issue, which is water quality and nitrogen. So I think environment is going to become more and more important. So that's on the breeding side of things. Now, the other side is for the culling. And most traits follow this normal distribution. All of your height, if I was to measure your height or measure your weights in the room, most of us are in around the average. There's some really tall people and there's some really small people. And what we do in breeding is we tend to identify the animals who are on the good side of the spectrum. So they're the high-producing, high-fertile animals, and we breed from those. And we shift the distribution to the right by doing that. However, you can also shift the distribution to the right by culling the opposite side. And Deborah would have touched on this in their development of the culling index, which is great because now I get to boast and say that we actually developed the culling index 6 years ago. And actually around 35% of dairy farmers now actively use this culling index. And you can see the details beside it. But it's like, as Deborah described, is we're trying to predict the future profit potential of each female, be it a heifer or be it a cow. So if you have 2 cows, one is second lactation, one is 10th lactation, they're genetically the same, which one are you going to cull? You're going to cull the old one because eventually she's going to die. And the fact that you can put these on heifers and on cows, this can actually tell you what is your voluntary culling rate. So once your heifers are no better than your worst cow, then you stop culling. So it includes the current lactation, it includes what's her future potential, so how many more lactations is she likely to live for, and also when you cull her, you're going to get money back, but then you also have to replace her. Now, Deborah actually stole all my thunder. She stole my slides, but she also presented something like this, where she showed that P is equal to G plus E. Right, so this is the same thing. Performance is equal to the environmental effects plus the genetic effects. So if you go onto the fields and you see a cow producing milk, she's producing milk because of how you manage her, that's the environment, and because of her genetic potential. So if we just look at milk yield, for example, it's a function of the cow's parity, her age. Is she a crossbred? Is herd year season effect? So how did you feed her this year? What was the weather like this year? Genetics, and this thing called the permanent environmental effect, which, as the name suggests, is an environmental effect that's permanent with an animal throughout its life. So, for example, if you're playing Aussie rules or you're playing rugby, if you broke your leg, you're probably not going to be as good a player there afterwards, but you don't transmit that broken leg to your offspring. So that's a permanent environmental effect. So a cow, if she lost a quarter, she only has 3 quarters, she can only produce less than what her genetic potential is. And in genetic evaluations, what we do is we fit statistical models like this and we decompose them down to their individual components. And what the likes of Matt Schaefer presents then is the estimate of genetic merit. That's the genetic merit of the animal. But when we're devising our decision support tool on culling, we also add back in, is she crossbred? What's her permanent environmental effect? So was she reared well as a heifer or poorly as a heifer? And also her age. And this gives us what we call our estimated production of values. And the key thing about this is it enables us to compare crossbred animals to purebred animals on the same scale, which would be an issue again in Australia. The crossbred effect is not in their genetic potential. Yet we know, based on Australia, but some New Zealand data, that crossbred animals tend to live for one more lactation. So we should reward them for such. So that's the top of this. Now, if we move on towards if we have identified the genetically poor animals, what are we going to do with our genetically poor dairy cows? Well, we don't really want to keep any replacements from them, so we should mate them to a beef bull. And we're seeing internationally that beef usage on dairy cows or dairy females is increasing dramatically, especially in Ireland as our reproductive performance improves, as sex semen becomes more and more adopted. There's a greater potential there to use beef semen. So we developed a decision support tool just exactly the same as your BPI, your Balanced Performance Index for selecting dairy bulls. We have a dairy beef index for selecting beef bulls for use on dairy cows. Showing you the publication there if you want to dig into it. Also underneath it you can see validation, because we like to validate these things and prove to people that they actually are materialize into greater profit. This graph is showing you the emphasis within the trait. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to marry what the dairy farmer wants, which is an easy calving, short gestation length calf. We're trying to marry that with what the beef farmer wants, which is a good stocky animal with good efficiency. Now, you could say to me, that's impossible, because if you want a good big stocky calf, you're going to have to pull it out of the cow, and the dairy farmer doesn't want that. And you'd be right to say that on average. But I would turn back to you and say, well, if that's the case, let's stop selecting for fertility, or let's stop selecting for milk, because they're also antagonistically correlated with each other. And that's the beauty of decision support tools like these breeding goals, is it enables us to identify animals who are superior under both suites of traits. And we're seeing a good adoption. We only launched this 2 years ago. We're seeing a high adoption of this. And I believe that this is going to become more and more important into the future globally, as there's more social pressure on what we do with the surplus calves from dairy. The next decision support tool I'm talking about is Sire Advice. And there are tools here. Again, I'm showing some work from the likes of Jenny. I know Matt asked me to talk a lot about Ireland, but it'd be remiss to ignore all the stuff that Australia are doing. Australia are world leaders in this area, all these decision support tools. So if we're talking about Sire Advice, we need our considerations that we need to consider are the complementarity genetically between the bull and the female. So, for example, major genes. If you're talking about beef, myostatin would be a very good example, but you're also talking about lethal fertility mutations, etc. Co-ancestry, so the relationships between animals is very important to minimize the accumulation of inbreeding. I believe you had Tui was talking about that, I think, yesterday. Not an issue for dairy beef, of course, because they're completely unrelated. Also, this is what's missing in a lot in the sire advice systems that exist, is the female features. So you could have a small little heifer. You don't really want to put a big bull on that, right? But if you had a good, mature, large cow, you could get away with using a more difficult calving bull with a bit more shape to its calf, right? The other one, which I think we've ignored also so far, is what I would call homogeneity or heterogeneity. And this is an area that we're currently working on, is the variability in the progeny. Right? I'm just giving you a quick example here about the likelihood of a calving difficulty risk. I have two bulls. One is in blue. So this bull is high reliability. He's going to produce calves that are difficult calving, difficult-ish calving. But there's a tight spread there. So we're pretty confident that there are not going to be any crazy animals out there. While the red bull is a bull who on average is easier calving, but he produces more heterogeneous, more variable progeny. So Graham mentioned I'm a beef farmer. I'm here in the office talking to you guys. Cows are about to calve. I actually go for the blue bull. I go for the bull who is slightly more difficult calving, but he doesn't throw any massively big calves, 1 in 50 or 1 in 20. Right? So this is in a way, and this is what breeding is like. It's you're hedging your bets. It's the same as the stock exchange, or the same as betting on horses. Right? You're kind of betting each way here. Okay, so you're minimizing your risk. Another pet project of mine is this thing called blues. I believe we're going to do more and more about this, and this is again going back to this equation, which is performance is equal to the genotype plus the environment. So the performance of a cow is a function of its genotype and its environment. And as I said, what we do is we decompose in our genetic evaluations, Matt and the guys, they produce estimates of genetic merit. We call them BLUPs, and they publish it. So if you open up a bull catalogue, you see a bull's proof for milk or fertility, that's its BLUP. But what they actually throw away, we do also, everybody in the world does actually, what they throw away is the environmental effect, which we call blues. So what we could actually do, and this could scare some people, is we can actually, like we produce a proof for a bull, we can produce a proof for all the farmers. And why I'm interested in this in particular, what really got me interested in this was, at one of our open days, a farmer came up to me and he asked me for some bulls with high protein percentage. He said his protein percentage was low. Can I recommend some bulls? So I said, like what Deborah had, open up your app and show me your herd. I looked at the genetics of his herd and I said, there's nothing wrong with your genetics. You're really good on protein percentage. I said, what's your pastures like? And he said, oh, their permanent pasture is very poor. I said, go away and talk to the grass person. So he was automatically, and you know, this is maybe a chip on my shoulder as a geneticist, is breeding always gets the blame. It just, the fertility is bad, oh, must be the breeding, must be the genetics. If the milk is bad, oh, has to be a bad bull. It's nothing to do with the farmer. So in this situation, what you're doing is you're telling the farmer that actually he is 200 or she is 200 kilograms less milk below their genetic potential, or their fertility is 2% below their genetic potential. So breeding isn't going to get them out of this problem, right? It's management is what they need to address. So you're, again, with decision support tools, what you're trying to do is target the advice to individual farmers. You all know about those emails that you get. They're just blanket emails to everybody. They only really relate to around 10% of the people. Yet, if you actually got one email that's just addressed to you with particular points pertinent to you, you're more likely to act on it. As I said here, if we just look at a herd, and like if you go through those publications I just showed you, we give you actually real life examples where there are herds there that had average fertility, so they're pretty happy, but there are different types of herds. One of those herds had really bad genetics or really good management that compensated for it. In that situation, if they had really bad genetics, then they need to talk to the AI stations and get better bulls. While in the opposite situation, you had farmers who had really good genetics but were crap managers. And there's no point talking to breeding about those guys. You need to get into them and figure out how are they managing from a reproductive perspective. Moving quickly on to then sex semen, because sex semen is kind of all over the place at the moment, and there is the whole notion of, well, can we predict the receptiveness of cows to sex semen. Deborah as well talked about machine learning and AI. Matt actually asked me to talk about it. I'm going to talk about it at the very, very end. To me, AI and machine learning are just a tool to help us achieve the end product. So if we have all our decision support tools wrong, machine learning and AI is just going to make us go faster in the wrong direction if you don't have your breeding goal right. So I actually don't care too much for machine learning or AI. But in a lot of these situations, machine learning, and we've done it ourselves, are used to try to predict the likelihood that a cow will conceive to a given pregnancy or a given service. I actually think after doing all the work and publishing it, I then say, well, it kind of is a waste of time because there's so much noise in the system in the future, like the technician and the technician by time. We know Mondays are always bad. Maybe it's just an Irish thing after the weekend. Actually, we must relook at the data after COVID because all the pubs are closed, so maybe it's not an impact anymore. The ejaculate of the bulls, or the herd changes over time, ovulation status, etc. So this is just showing you some data where we've tried to predict using machine learning the likelihood of becoming pregnant. What you see here is a 45, in blue is a 45-degree line. That means that there was no predictive ability. It was just like flipping a coin. And you can see that we are slightly above that in our predictive ability. So we didn't do too well in predicting the likelihood of pregnancy. Now, you might just say that we're useless statisticians, but you'll probably be right on that. But where you want to get is that red line, where you can predict with a good degree of accuracy whether a cow is likely to conceive or not. But I think that might be one of our faults, is that we try to give a prediction to everything. And again, this comes back to the whole notion of decision supporting tools. Should we try to be supporting decisions even though we're not confident? Just because the computer gives us a number, a prediction, should we put it out there? And I believe maybe not. So if we just looked at this exactly the same data and looked at the study and we only limited it to the cows where we were confident that they would become pregnant, we had a way better prediction accuracy. And I think farmers can accept that. You can give a prediction for some cows saying they're likely to go in calf, while in the other cows, you give them no prediction. And you just say, look, we don't know. Okay? So then moving on to, you have the cow and calf. Now the female has, or the males and the females have been born. So you have the surplus calves, or you have the females. And with Jo Newton, I know Jo in the audience there, she was over with us for a while. We developed a tool which is the cost benefit, and this is a freely available tool. If you want it, either contact Jo, Jenny will probably have it too, or contact myself. It's a tool that you can plug in your own details. If you're a sheep farmer or beef farmer, I just got them in despite Joe's kickbacks, but also for dairy farming. You can put in your parameters and it will tell you how much you can invest in genotyping for a cost benefit analysis. Okay, a very easy to use decision support tool, and this can all be built into web services. So once we've the animal genotyped, then we decide, well, is it going to be a lead female in the dairy herd, or is it surplus to requirements? Is it a male dairy calf, or is it a beef on dairy? I just want to focus on that part. So if we have beef from a dairy herd, so we have female calves that are beef from dairy, there's two options. One, you can slaughter them. So you can sell them to some beef producer, put them into a feedlot, grow them up and slaughter them. Again, I'm not fully sure how it is in Australia, but in Ireland, around 20% of our beef herd actually come from the dairy herd. So we have two decision support tools. One, which puts a value on the calf to go into the mature beef herd. What is its value? How much profit is it going to relay back to you? This is the same as the index we had for the dairy cow. What's the remaining profit of that dairy cow? Except we've done it for beef. And the other one is for looking at the calf. So what is the value of that calf if you were to slaughter it in a few year or year and a half time? That's the BOW, is what we call it, the beef own worth. And very quickly, just to go through that, it uses these estimated production values again, which are the sum of your genetic effects, the gender. Look, we know there's a big difference between males and females and their growth, twin or not, what age of a cow came from. There is a difference in carcass weight depending if it came from a heifer or from an older cow. The dam permanent environmental effect, and also is it crossbred. So we include all those components in this beef's own worth. The traits we currently include are obviously the carcass traits, carcass weight, conformation and fat score, feed intake and efficiency, because we have that on beef animals, indoor feeding, and docility. And the other one that we've just recently launched is for dairy male calves. So in Ireland, I think there's around 150,000 male calves we exported last year. We don't have a veal industry in Ireland, so we export them over 10 days of age to the Netherlands for veal production. But the exporters really want calves that are 50 kilos. They don't really care too much about age. They have to be a minimum of 10 days to leave the farm. You have a similar rule in Australia. But they want calves to be around 50 kgs in age. Our dairy herds are expanding dramatically, and our infrastructure probably isn't expanding with it. So what we are seeing is probably a compromise in the welfare of specifically male dairy cows. So one of the tools we developed was, well, what would be the infrastructural needs, or can we devise what the infrastructural needs would be for a dairy farmer, depending on their calving pattern, which we know before the calf is even born, and then the likelihood or the timing that these dairy male calves will hit 50 kilos so they can sell them off the farm. So here is just a kind of a calving pattern. We have a seasonal production system like some of Victoria's, that we just have one season in the spring. So this is your birth. So as the calves are being born, you're going to need to have labor there. You're going to need to have infrastructure there to house them. And you could assume that, look, I'm going to sell my calves at on average 17 days of age. That's when they're going to hit 50 kilos. So this is your projected sale dates. And you can work out then in advance, like several months in advance, how much calf space you're going to need and how much labor you're going to need and how much feed actually you're also going to need. But what actually, and yes, you decide on your infrastructural needs. But what actually if the actual sale date was later because of the genetics that you use? And in fact, if we look at it, and this is just within dairy male calves, there's an 18-day difference between the fastest and the slowest 10% of calves that growing for hitting 50 kgs. So you could be planning this out, and you could actually end up holding on to some of these calves for 3 weeks longer than what you actually anticipated. And that has huge ramifications for your allocation of resources. So my final slide, just coming up to time, is, for me, if I stand back and look at decision support tools, they must be easy to use and understand. BPI, great example of a decision support tool that's easy to understand. It's one number. If you want to make it complicated, you can make it complicated. It's real time and it's accurate, right? So accuracy is a function of obviously the reliability when it comes to BPI. Nothing can be really 100% accurate in agriculture. Also, and this is maybe why I showed you the slide at the start, is it has to be joined up. So if you use a bull who's got a good dairy beef index, you want to produce a calf, your transaction index, that BOW index of the value of the calf, better line up with that bull that you use. So you don't want to be using an excellent bull for a dairy breeding index, have a calf, and then your transaction index says, oh, that was a rubbish calf, you stupid fool. You want those things lined up completely, right? And that has to be forward and backward compatible. The beauty about what I talked is it's what I call is modular. So if Jenny comes up with a new trait like feed saved or meat, we just plug it in and it flows all the way down through the system. We can plug it into the COW, plug it into our breeding index, plug it into the calf index, plug it into everything. It's multifunctional. It's kind of agnostic to species, so we can do this in sheep. It exploits currently existing data, so things like phenotype, and as we get new data, we can add it in. And then, as Matt asked me to talk about AI and machine learning, to me, as I said, it's just like talking about statistics. It's just another way to achieve an end goal. However, there's two things I would like to just quickly mention on AI, and that is explainable AI, I think will become important. This is where you get an answer from your algorithm, but you can help explain it. So as humans, if I was to tell you it's going to rain tomorrow, you should ask, well, how do you know? Well, it's because blah, 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 blah. So that's what explainable AI is. And the other one is what we call counterfactuals, which is you're running out of feed, you're going to have to feed silage. Or sorry, you're going to have to feed concentrates. You need to buy concentrates. The counterfactual is, well, if you actually introduce silage over the next week or two, you could reduce the amount of concentrates that you feed. So that's it, Graham. If there's any questions, I'll take them.
Thanks very much, Donagh. As per normal, cut to the chase and put it in terms I think everyone can understand. We have Hurt is sent in a question for you. Good on it. Why do fertility evaluations not work in good herds? How do you fix this?
So, Hert, we can take this offline. So the fertility trait we use is calving interval, which is probably one of the worst traits that you could use in a seasonal calving system, because the cows that do not recalve have no calving interval, right? And what you're really looking for is the animals who calve at the start of the calving season. So if you have an animal that starts at the calving season, and you're in a seasonal calving system, that animal automatically will have a long calving interval, because it's going to have a long voluntary waiting period. So what we are moving to is something like the New Zealand situation, which is, well, we haven't decided yet, but it'll probably be something like calving in the first 21 days of the calving season.
Okay, thanks. So any from the floor or any other, it's only Slido question that we've got. So I'm going to take this opportunity on behalf of the room. I'd like to thank Donagh for his presentation, as wish you were here. But this is as good as we can get, so wonderful to have you here.
Good stuff.